federalism divides power. And so I talk about how the framers of the US Constitution were very motivated to divide power. They were really suspicious of central power and central government. They were coming out of a monarchy, obviously, had fought a whole war on this. And so they were very careful in the Constitution not to centralize too much power. And one of the ways they did this was through separation of powers, which I usually talk about as kind of a horizontal division of power, where at the federal level, the judicial branch has powers, the executive branch has powers, the legislative branch has certain powers. Federalism is kind of a vertical division of power where the federal government controls some things, and the states and the states and localities control some things. And I think elections provide a really good example of how this works in practice. And so when it comes to elections, the states have a great deal of authority that is given to them through the US Constitution in Article 1, where Article 1 sets out kind of the powers of the national government versus the powers of the states, and then the concurrent powers that the two share. And so the elections clause of Article 1 gives states the power to set the time, place, and manner of congressional elections. And because our presidential elections coincide with congressional elections, this also means that the states set at least the place and manner. It was a statute later, after the Constitution was in place, that gave us our national election day every 4 years. But other than that, the states decide how elections are going to take place, for the most part, who can vote, how they can vote, where they can vote, the polling hours, things like that are all established at the state level. Where the federal government comes in when it comes to elections is it establishes that the term of a U.S. House member is 2 years, a senator is 6 years, the president is 4 years. It, by statute, determines that date for elections is going to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November, and those sorts of things. And then it has, as we will see, the U.S. Constitution added guarantees about the right to vote. And so this critical question that you all will be discussing for the next several weeks, who gets to vote? Much of that is through federal guarantee as sort of a floor, right? That everybody in certain groups, as it's added to the Constitution, has a right to vote. How that plays out in the practice really is a state level power. So states typically control registration, vote counting, the calendar, the time, the determination of results. Where localities are also very involved. In most states, it's counties. Here, of course, it's parishes. But the county governments or parish governments are responsible for things like drawing precinct lines, determining sort of where voting machines will go, training poll workers, and making sure precincts are staffed, the actual administration of the election on the day of. That's largely a local power. So let me make sure. Okay, just making sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. So a little bit about these extensions, the right to vote extended to. So pre-revolution and for the first half of the 19th century, only white, largely Christian men who owned property and were over 21 years of age were able to vote. For example, only about 6% of the population were eligible to vote in our first presidential election. And this was the case for most of the 19th century. In 1856, North Carolina became the last state to remove property ownership as a requirement, so that all white men over the age of 21 were eligible to vote as of 1856. Then we start to get the amendments to the Constitution that extend suffrage to particular groups that had been excluded up to that point. And so in 1870, the 15th Amendment guarantees the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this did not include sex, right? It didn't extend at that point to women. So this was a guarantee of the right to vote for African-American men, largely were the ones that this extended to. And I do have in parentheses there, really only theoretically, that for the next almost 100 years, African-American men who theoretically had been enfranchised in 1870 had to fight for that right to vote within most states. And particularly here in the South. I wanted to give an example of one of the ways in which states, and this is Louisiana, this is a literacy test out of Louisiana that was common in the late 19th century and up to and including the 1960s in many states. And so when I talk about literacy tests with my students, some students, when you hear literacy tests, you think of the ability to read and can make an argument that maybe we want to extend suffrage only to those who are able to read, right? That there might be reasons for limiting suffrage to those who are illiterate. But in practice, the way that literacy tests worked were much more like this. So draw a line around the number of or letter of this sentence. How do you make sense of that? Draw a line under the last word in this line. And they get sort of more confusing as they go. And this was not uncommon. This is just an example of a Louisiana literacy test, but we saw this all over the country, particularly in the South, but not exclusively. These were a way during particularly the Jim Crow period for Southern states to prevent African-American men who were supposedly enfranchised in 1870 from voting, that if they couldn't pass this test, then they couldn't register to vote and therefore they couldn't vote. One thing about this was that on these tests, let's say you got everything right, that you answered all the questions correctly on the test. The grader was usually a county or a parish election official, a registrar of voters, for example, or someone at a parish clerk office or a county courthouse, these sorts of positions. And they were the ones who decided whether or not you passed in most cases. And so you could get everything right and still not pass the test and be able to register to vote. And that was quite common throughout the South during this period. So other extensions of suffrage to women, which were the largest block of individuals that were officially excluded throughout the 19th century. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1890. And there were many states between 1890 and 1920 who allowed women to vote. And some of those allowed women to vote in all elections. Some states allowed women to vote only in state or local elections, but not federal elections. And then there were states where women couldn't vote in any election. Until 1920, with the 19th Amendment that granted suffrage to women. And this was the result of a movement that began in the 1830s and 1840s, the movement for women's suffrage. And you're going to read more about that in the coming weeks. I sometimes, hear students say that when women won the right to vote, and I always say, no, women earned the right to vote with the movement and the generations of women who fought for that. And not just women fighting, there were lots of men involved in the suffrage movement as well. But it was certainly an earned right to vote in 1920. I will point out here too that it took until 1980 for women to vote at the same rate as men. So it took a couple of generations of women after women earned the right to vote in 1920 for women to vote at the same and on par with men. Now women vote women vote more than men. So we have exceeded men in that respect in terms of our likelihood of turning out. Native Americans also, again, earned the right to vote in 1924 with a statute, an act of Congress. This was not an amendment to the Constitution. And this still in many states that have significant proportions of Native Americans continues to be a controversy. And I can talk a little bit about what is at the heart of that. And then in 1952, another act of Congress lifted restrictions on Asian immigrants, their ability to become naturalized citizens and therefore exercise their right to vote. And so continuing on here, there were 3 other important amendments to the Constitution worth mentioning when we talk about who gets to vote. The 23rd Amendment gave residents of the District of Columbia the right to vote for president, essentially gave DC 3 electoral votes in the Electoral College, but no congressional representation. The District of Columbia has a delegate in the House, but no representation in the Senate, and that delegate doesn't have a vote. So they have some representation, but not a vote. And that is currently a movement that has gotten off the ground again, that has sort of come and gone over the years. And we're seeing that movement again as DC has grown in population. It used to kind of be a place where like members of Congress and members of the federal bureaucracy would sort of live there part-time and then would go home to their states or their districts for part of the time. Now there's a growing population of individuals that live full-time in DC. And so we'll see if that movement becomes something larger. But the 24th Amendment in 1964 outlawed poll taxes. Poll taxes were another common way, just like the literacy test during the Jim Crow period, of restricting the vote, particularly for African Americans. It also theoretically restricted voting for poor whites who couldn't afford the poll tax. But there again, those parish or county officials that would grade the literacy test also had the authority in many cases to waive the tax. And so if someone came in and said, I can't pay this, they could choose to waive that if they wanted to, and often would choose to waive that for certain people, but not others. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act outlawed many other discriminatory practices. Literacy tests were a part of this in 1965. And one of the things that was unique about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, as opposed to other voting rights acts, there were others that preceded it. There was one in the 1950s. There were a couple in the late 19th century. So this was not the first Voting Rights Act. But what made it different was that it had enforcement provisions. So it wasn't just that the law changed, but it was that the law included the ability to enforce those new laws through the Department of Justice. And so one aspect of this was through what's called pre-clearance. So any state that had a history of discriminatory practices needed to, before that state could change their law related to voting, needed to get the federal Department of Justice to approve that, to pre-clear that law. That has since been rescinded by the Supreme Court fairly recently in a case, Shelby County versus Holder, during the Obama administration, that case was decided. But there were a whole variety of enforcement provisions through the Department of Justice. They could bring suit, they could prevent certain changes to laws. And so this gave the Voting Rights Act some teeth, right? So if states tried to continue to abridge the right to vote, there was a mechanism there to force them not to do those things. And then in 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the minimum age to vote to 18 from 21. The Vietnam War had a lot to do with this. The argument that if we're sending 18-year-old, mostly boys, off to war, that they should also be able to vote. And this was a big part of that push in the late 1960s, and finally was added to the Constitution in 1971. So there are a whole variety of contemporary controversies. There's a reason that you're studying this right now and not something else, although there's controversies everywhere. And so I can talk about a few of these, but I thought we would also, as a group, talk about some of these controversies around voter registration and a related controversy of voter fraud.
I'm just listening. Yeah,
there's a whole bunch of controversies around voter technology. And so if we sort of think about these in tandem, voter registration really boils down to this question that you're asking, right? Who gets to vote? Because in the United States, you're required to be a registered voter in order to vote. And so when we talk about who gets to register and how they register and what they have to bring with them to show that they can register, all of those things, what we're talking about is who gets to vote. In some countries, you don't have to register to vote. You are a citizen of that country, and it's automatic once you turn 18 or once you're the minimum age in that country, you're eligible to vote. And you don't have to have a separate voter registration. And so what we're really talking about here is who gets to register and how do they register. And so the controversies are around those questions. The voter fraud question comes in related to registration oftentimes, but it's a question about the prevention. Everybody wants to prevent fraud. Nobody wants people voting more than one time, or people who shouldn't be voting in certain elections, voting in those elections. I shouldn't be able to go and vote in Orleans Parish and Jefferson Parish and, St. Tammany Parish, And so, how do we minimize fraud? Are sort of the heart of that. With voting technology, it's really a question of how, right? How should we vote? And I have lived I've been a voter in, I think, 5 states. And I've had 5 different mechanisms of voting. And Louisiana, it had, I think, some of the most advanced systems of the states that I've lived in. In Maryland, when I voted there were these tiny little levers on the polling places and on each of the actual polls. And so, you voted for president and you pulled a little lever, and you voted for Senate and you voted for, city council. And you might have like 50 of these tiny little levers. And then at the bottom, you had this big thing that you pulled that would, count your vote and reset everything for the next person. Rhode Island, you got an actual pencil and you drew a line from the office to the candidate that you wanted. We all remember 2000 and in Florida, where they were the punch cards that you had to poke holes through a sort of Scantron sheet that was sent through a machine to be counted. And then there is kind of what we have here in Louisiana, the electronic voting system, where you just punch buttons just like you do on an iPad or any other machine like that, and then press the vote at the bottom. But there are all different kinds of ways in which to vote, and they all have, yes, hanging chads, exactly. They all have different different advantages and disadvantages. One of the big questions is around particularly electronic voting. We saw a lot more electronic machines after 2000. Many states, there was funding for states to upgrade their voting technology. And so a lot of states that didn't have electronic voting before 2000 got it in the years after that election. And one of the big questions is whether there's a paper trail, right? Whether each machine has an ability to recount the votes in that election, or in that from that machine. There are all sorts of questions also about disenfranchisement and enfranchisement. The history here, as I've presented, is mostly one of expanding suffrage. We haven't had really contractions. We haven't had periods where people who were eligible to vote suddenly became not eligible to vote. But we still do have groups in society that are disenfranchised, and there are controversies around whether they should be enfranchised. The biggest group here currently is convicted felons. And so whether someone who has been convicted of a felony should lose their right to vote for some period of time or for their entire life. And we see a great deal of variation across the states in this question, and how felons are whether they have the right to vote. And Sophie asks about voters with disabilities. And that is a really important question, both in terms of the technology and the disenfranchisement. So the ability that different technologies are harder for some groups than others. I remember in 2000 in Florida, there was a controversial ballot in, I think, I'm forgetting the name of the county in southern Florida, but where a large percentage of the population is elderly. And so there were lots and lots of candidates on the ballot, and they were concerned that if they printed all of the candidates in sort of a column with the way that we normally see candidates, right? So you would have, in 2000, it was, Bush and Gore and Buchanan, but there were, 50 or 60 candidates that they wouldn't all fit on one page. And so one solution to that was to shrink the names, right? To have really small font. And shrink it so that it would fit on one page. Well, they were worried about the population being able to see it. And so then they split them into two columns with the punch card holes in the middle. And so you had Bush, Buchanan, Gore. And so many people saw Gore as the second name on the row and punched the second hole, but they were actually voting for Buchanan. And so, it was a very...
I was only like 4, so I don't remember that, but I voted crazy.
Yeah, it was, it was all very well-intentioned. The people that it was called a butterfly ballot because it had, the wings on two sides.
Right.
And it was very well intentioned to try and make things easier for the population of voters in that county, with very bad effects. So it's very good to hear that Louisiana is accommodating. And their technology offers a lot of benefits, but it can also, I think what we need is people at the table who really understand different communities, right? Communities of people with different disabilities, of communities of, folks from all over the place to really kind of look at these things. And too often we don't have that. Too often we kind of have people that don't have all that experience. Yeah, large magnifying glasses or magnifying pages, that helps too. Yeah, but that's certainly one of those communities that I think gets too little attention when we talk about voting, for sure. The last thing on here, and then I'll stop talking for a while and open up to discussion, is about how votes are counted. This is a big controversy. The Electoral College, a few words about that, but we are unique in having an Electoral College. And it is a compromise. When the framers wrote the Constitution, they couldn't really figure out what to do about the executive. They worried about having a single executive because they thought the executive would become too king-like, and they didn't want to create a system that was anything like the one that they had just fought a war to get away from. And so they debated about whether the executive should be a committee, whether the executive, whether they shouldn't have an executive, but they also had just come out of the Articles of Confederation, and that they didn't have an executive for the first several years and didn't work very well. And so the way they fixed that was to have a single executive, but to split up the way in which votes are counted. And so rather than have a national vote, which was never actually really considered by the framers. It wasn't Electoral College versus popular vote. It was really Electoral College versus Congress selecting the president. Because that's how the senators were elected. So we didn't directly elect our US senators until 1913 with an amendment to the Constitution. And so we elected our state representatives who elected our US senators, or who appointed our US senators from the states. The same provision was proposed about presidents, that we would elect our congressional representatives and they would select the president. And they decided to come up with this Electoral College as kind of a compromise, that votes would be counted at the state level and states would decide how those votes are counted. And then in that group, of electors would officially cast the ballot. There would be some protection from the masses that the framers didn't trust very much, to have this group of electors who would actually do the electing of the president. And so the way this is a controversy is that there's a whole host of controversies around the Electoral College, and that you can have, as we have seen in recent elections, a president who loses the popular vote, right? Who doesn't win the most votes. And majority rule tends to be a pretty important principle to democracy, that, whoever gets the most votes wins. And we can have, with the Electoral College, an election where the person with the most votes doesn't actually become president. And we've seen this at least twice in recent years. And in our history, there have been, I think, 6 of these where there was controversy anyway around the Electoral College. And then there are current controversies around the fact that we are such a polarized country right now, that the whole red states versus blue states thing, and that and all that goes along with that. And I'm happy to talk about that, and we can talk about that as a group. Redistricting becomes another part of this, sort of how the Tilden-Hayes election. Tilden had the popular vote and was 1 vote short in the Electoral College, but nonetheless lost. The president. We don't talk about a President Tilden ever. So, and The last thing here are just, I thought I would talk about who is more likely to vote, in just statistically speaking. Generally speaking, older people are more likely to vote than younger people. And white people are more likely to vote than people of color. Right now, women vote at higher rates than men. Higher income and more highly educated individuals are more likely to vote than their counterparts. And homeowners tend to vote at higher rates than renters. And I think I have one more slide, and then I promise I'm gonna shut up. I've been saying that. And how can we increase turnout? There are a whole host of ways, and we can talk about these as we talk about the controversies. But I already mentioned automatic registration, but there's also many states have moved to something called same-day registration, where there is no residency requirement, where you can go and register on election day and vote on that day, that you don't have to wait. Some countries have compulsory voting where you have to vote, or you get fined. That's a good way to get to high turnout. We can make voting easier. The easier it is, the more people vote, whether it's voting by mail, whether it's having more places, more precincts. There's a lot of political science that shows, not surprisingly, that the closer you live to your polling place, the more likely you are to vote. And so if we had more polling places, we would probably have higher turnout. Better funding, the kinds of things that we've seen in recent elections with long lines, those sorts of things. A lot of that comes down to funding for poll workers and voting technology. And then there's a whole host of structural changes too. Typically, the more competitive the election, the more people turn out. And that's kind of obvious, right? Because if you think your vote matters, you're going to go and vote. But if it's a kind of a foregone conclusion, whether you're for the person who's ahead or for the person who's behind, right? If your candidate's winning and it's raining or the weather's bad or there's a really long line, you're gonna be like, well, he or she's already gonna win. Why do they need my vote? And the same is true, if your candidate's losing. Like, it's not gonna make any difference for me. And so the more competitive the elections are, the higher the turnout tends to be.